All right. Hi, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. And, being in this room reminds me of one of my favorite authors that comes from the city just next door from Geneva, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. I'm a big fan of Rousseau. I have a poster of Rousseau next to the one of Justin Bieber in my own room. And Rousseau has a lot to do, in a way, with what I want to talk about, right? With a kind of radical democracy, radical participatory democracy that contemporary movements are developing, and the type of political art that is emerging within these movements. So what I want to ask today is a question, a very simple question, in a way. So is there such a thing as political digital art, or, if you prefer, digital political art? It's always a matter, right, of a distinction, which word we use first. Is there such a thing? Spoiler warning, I'll give you the spoiler now. Not really, right? It's not really there. There are signs of it, but there is not such a thing as a kind of systemic political art using digital media within these movements. So, to give you some context, the presentation I'm delivering today is part of my research about protest culture and digital culture. I'm really interested in the connection between these two things. And in the connection between these two things at the time of social media, at the time of social network sites like Facebook and Twitter that have paradoxically become popular protest platforms. Taking the place that in the previous protest wave, in the protest wave of the anti-globalization movement, was taken by autonomous activist platforms, such as indie media, such as alternative ISPs, alternative mailing lists, and so on and so forth. I've been looking at different movements through an ethnographic perspective, spending a lot of time in Cairo, spending time in Spain, looking at the acampadas in Spain, at the protest encampments, spending time in the US, and more recently in Brazil and Turkey, and really trying to get at the question of what is specific to this protest wave, and what is specific to the digital culture that we see in this protest wave. And this has been my product, the product of these trips, of this research, Tweets on the Streets, the book I published last year. I'm currently working on a new book that looks more, rather than at the means, at the media, more at the content of the new protest culture. And how the content of the new protest culture is different from previous protest movements. So moving to today's question, so the question of, is there such a thing as a digital political art fitting the times? I think that it's always important to look at things in an historical perspective. Right? It's always important to compare what we see now with what happened before, right? With the past, in this case, the very recent past of the 90s, of the pioneering period of the web, of the so-called Web 1.0, of static website, of HTML, of animated GIFs. This was a very exciting time because it was a time in which a new medium was opening up and different artists were trying to exploit the specificities of that medium. There was all a new scene, the so-called net art scene, that precisely tried to develop a new artistic language through the code of the web, right? Through the materiality and symbolic functions of the web. And interestingly, this scene was also very strongly politicized. Many of the artists who participated in this scene were actually people who felt part of the anti-globalization movement and who saw their art as artivism, that is a portmanteau of art and activism, as a form of political engagement, not just art pour l'art, but something that had kind of a political significance. I'll just show you some examples. This was a very famous performance, really, I would call it, digital performance, Vaticano.org. It is a spoof website of the Vatican, produced by a group that I won't get the name exactly because it's a string, it's a numerical string, 0100110011.org, right? That was one of the groups that was playing with these new techniques, right, as means of political expression. So what this website was an almost perfect copy of the official Vatican website. Only if you went inside, if you look at the content, you would find, details that you wouldn't expect, right? I mean, the Pope, saying strange things, right, bordering on the satanical, right, and so on and so forth. And it was an example of these cyber squatting, right, practices. This idea that the web is a new space that we can take, is a new space that, much alike the city, much alike the squats, the real squats, the squatted buildings, can be taken, can be occupied, right? And we can do their things that are somehow similar to the things we do in urban space. I mean, there were many other artivists in this scene, Artie Mark, the Yes Man. There was all a series of people working there. There were people working using video games as a form of artivism. The most famous example was Molla Industria, a group, actually one person, called Paolo Pedercini, who has been very, very skilled in using video games as a political language. There you see a still picture from possibly his most famous political video game called McDonald's, when people can be a McDonald's CEO and can manage the different branches of McDonald's, can manage the fields of McDonald's, and so on and so forth, as a way to learn, basically, about McDonald's, right? As a form of political pedagogy, right? Through which one learns how wicked McDonald's actually is. So, all in all, what this art was, this digital political art was about, was the idea of another internet is possible, right? Was the idea, much alike the slogan of the World Social Forum, the biggest organ of the anti-globalization movement that famously proclaimed another world is possible, the digital political art, organic to the anti-globalization movement, thought that another internet is possible. The internet is a sort of enormous, vast space, is a far west, with no frontier, where we can build our own autonomous communities, where we can build our own self-governed cyber villages, or whatever, right? So now I move to the 2010s, right? And if I'm talking for too long, please throw an iPhone at me, and I will stop, yeah? And, I mean, we see in current forms of digital expression, and especially in those forms that approximate something akin to digital political art, an imaginary that is profoundly different from the imaginary that sustained digital political art at the time of the anti-globalization movement. It is an imaginary that is profoundly different because it engages with different platforms. It doesn't have much to do with creating autonomous platforms, but it has to do instead, to a great extent, with occupying the digital mainstream. Occupying those platforms where millions of people virtually gather, where not only us, but our brothers, our mothers, our fathers, and sometimes even our grandfathers and our grandmothers are gathering. So spaces that are not anymore minoritarian spaces, elitist spaces, but increasingly mass spaces, right? Generic spaces, right? In which hundreds of millions of people gather, right? And which offer new possibilities, new potentialities for a radical politic. So the interesting thing there, though, is that if one looks now at what digital political art can be, I mean, the examples that one finds are much fewer than one would have found at the time of the anti-globalization movement, right? Or at least they are not as visible at all as they were back in the times, back in the 90s and early 2000s. There is not such a thing as a scene, as a systemic scene involved in net art, in tactical media, as there was a decade ago. right? I mean, there are some examples of new forms of digital political art. One example comes from this picture there. That's a still of a performance by a group called FAT, that stands for Free Art and Technology, Free Art and Technology Collective, that during the Occupy Wall Street movement in 2011, precisely in October 2011, invited people to use animated GIFs as sort of virtual occupiers for websites, right? So you are in solidarity with the occupation, post one of these animated GIFs on your website, right? People, not profits, I'm not your ATM. There was another very funny one that said, I will make net art for food, right? I mean, I guess some people in the room, the artists in this room will empathize, I guess, with these animated GIFs. There are new forms of art that are interesting that somehow merge digital space and public space. For example, this illuminator performance using very powerful projectors. They are being called like the Batman signal, right? They use this projector to project images on buildings. It is not Batman. It is, Free Pussy Riot or We Are the 99%, as you can see in this other still, right? But the interesting thing, all in all, is that is precisely this increasing merging between digital culture and street culture. And this return in popularity of street art that is particularly visible in Egypt. It was an incredible resurgence of street art, but it's also visible across different other countries. So, to conclude, to move towards a conclusion, so where are the digital political artists? Where are they? Where do they hide? What's their address? I mean, I don't know that. I cannot share that, unfortunately. But what one sees is that what we witness to nowadays is the rise of a sort of distributed artists, of a crowd of amateur artists, the producers of the famous internet memes, people who can use Photoshop or other image editing softwares, and who don't call themselves artists, but they are involved in digital creativity and who are responsible for producing these famous internet memes that then circulate virally across digital networks. I mean, I'm sure some people in this room will have seen this meme. I mean, this is a picture of this famous cop who I think it was the occupation in University of California, Davis, he sprayed very, with nonchalance, to use a local word, some students, and then he became the subject for a number of adaptations. In a Van Gogh picture, there he goes there, he's on the Constitution, right? And there he goes back to the days, right? And I mean, and it is just one example, right, of many examples, right? We remember possibly the Turkish girl in a red dress, right? There have been several examples of this internet meme, right? And I mean, I just stand with this because it's always nice. Artists always love to hear about the death of the artist, This is something that people have kind of prophesized forever. The artist is dead. I mean, there is a sort of kind of sadistic pleasure in saying, that the artist is dying. And I don't think this is actually the case. I mean, what we see instead is in a time of diffusion, of increasing popularization of digital culture and digital creativity, at a time at which digital culture doesn't equate anymore with counterculture, but increasingly equates with popular culture. At such time, we see a situation in which many more people than before, are involved in digital creativity. Many more people engage with a series of practices that very broadly we can call art or digital political art. So, to conclude, I mean, there are issues with this situation. I mean, to a certain extent, one can say that the level, the quality of political art production, to some extent, has been going down compared with the examples we saw before, with the example from the anti-globalization movement. So the kind of political art we see today is, to some extent, more popular. On the other extent, is not as sophisticated, as elaborated as digital political art was during the anti-globalization movement. There are possibly different reasons for this problem. I mean, on the one hand, definitely the dominance of platforms like Twitter and Facebook put strong limits on creativity. Much of net art was really playing with creating one's own websites, with using the language of the web in all its palette, in all its possible manifestations. But there is also sort of disenchantment, right, with digital language. In the sense that digital language is not as new as it was back in the 90s, where there really was a feeling that one could create a new tropes, new rhetorics, new forms of expression. So all in all, I think that the kind of challenge for artists, especially for artists who are involved in politics, is to engage with these emerging practices of digital popular culture, right, and develop a new synthesis that can kind of juggle these two values, the importance of popular culture and the importance of political art. Thanks very much.